Well, it was exactly 1 month ago yesterday. I was sitting in Dave Whetstone's barber chair, as is my custom about 12 times each year. And we were talking about life, faith, the Bible, our journey together as a church, as is our custom whenever I find myself sitting in his chair. While Dave's hands are busy doing his stuff with scissors and clippers and so forth, we're yakking away. Well, it happened to be the Thursday before Easter, and our conversation rested for a few minutes on what was then our current Sunday morning teaching series on stories of people who encountered Jesus. And I shared that series was projected to end with its 12th episode the Sunday after Easter. And so Dave asked simply, "Where are you heading next?" And at that time I didn't know, but I suggested it would likely be something a little more overtly related to our journey of discernment that we refer to as our consultation process. What about Nehemiah? David offered. And for the next 10 minutes or so, I quickly warmed up to the idea as we reflected together on some of the themes that might emerge from such a study and their relevance to our current journey as a community of faith. And now here we are. On the day we launched the planning phase of our discernment process, we're also launching a study of the Old Testament book of Nehemiah. I have it projected as a 5-week study, but there are some other themes later in the book that we might circle back to at some point as well. But for now, I invite you to take your Bibles and join me there, if you have them with you. If not, listen carefully and read it when you get home. The book of Nehemiah, you know where it is? I already told you it's an Old Testament book. You make your way, if you get to Kings and Chronicles, you're almost there. If you get to Psalms and Proverbs, you're too far. 4 little books in between there: 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Job, Psalms, Proverbs. So Job's not quite a little book, but Nehemiah, we're gonna jump in to the first 2 chapters here this morning. We're going to kind of take this, walk through this. You've already read part of it as our scripture focus this morning. We're going to go through this kind of as the story unfolds with some comment on it and pause a few places to connect with it in ways that we can. It begins kind of with the title, "These are the memoirs of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah." We don't know who father was. We know who son was through his story here. We're going to find a little bit more. It sets the stage in late autumn in the month of Kislev in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes' reign. I was at the fortress of Susa. Now, we need to pause, give a little explanation to some of this. Late autumn, month of Kislev by the Jewish calendar would have been late November, early December, depending on what day of that particular month. The year would have been about 445 BC. Prominent city of the Persian Empire was Susa. That location by today's maps is about 760 miles due east of Jerusalem. So it is almost a straight line. I go this way, according to your map, if you get the Mediterranean Sea and you get Jerusalem and you just keep going straight east, about 760 miles through Iraq and into Iran, because Susa, that area, is located near the western border of Iran, which puts it just past Iraq, okay? So that's where we are, that's where Nehemiah was at this time. It was a prominent city of the Persian Empire. The story continues. Hanani, one of my brothers, as far as we know, there's no reason to believe this wasn't a biological brother. Hanani, one of my brothers, again, this is written by Nehemiah, came to visit me with some other men who had just arrived from Judah. Remember, Jerusalem back some 760 miles to the west. Hananiah, one of my brothers, had come to visit me with some of the others who had just arrived from Judah. I asked them about the Jews who had returned there from captivity and about how things were going in Jerusalem. Now, there's a whole lot of history packed into that verse. Okay? Nehemiah is Jewish. He's not living in Judah. He is living in the Persian Empire because some 140 years earlier, as God had predicted, Judah was overrun and its best and brightest taken captive by the Babylonians. And so we refer to this as this Babylonian captivity, a period of 70 years. It's now been 140 years. It was 70 years until a remnant was allowed to return who actually rebuilt the temple, much smaller than previously, but they rebuilt the temple in about 515. Under the leadership of Zerubbabel, with the blessing of then Persian King Cyrus. You can read about that in the early chapters of Ezra. So we're another 70 years after that. There have been different groups allowed to go back to Judah, back to Jerusalem, to rebuild again the temple. And so here comes some visitors, a brother and some other men from Judah. And Nehemiah is saying, so how are things going back there? Phone service isn't real good. My internet's a little bit spotty. There's nothing like a first-hand report. Tell me, how are things really back in Judah? And here's their answer. And you were part of giving this answer in our reading earlier. They said to me, verse 3, things are not going well for those who return to the province of Judah. They are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem has been torn down, and the gates have been destroyed by fire. Nehemiah writes, when I heard this, I sat down and wept. In fact, for days I mourned, fasted, and prayed to the God of heaven. So Nehemiah's first response is sorrow over what he had learned, sorrow over the present state. His second response is to seek wisdom and help from the God of heaven. He says simply, for days I mourned, fasted, and prayed to the God of heaven. How many days? Well, what would it take? What would be normal? If you had something like this, some problem, some circumstance that you were just maybe powerless to change, or that was just so much beyond your resources. What do you say, 2 days, 3 days? What would you give to a burden like that, to seek God's wisdom and God's help? Until it's fixed. Someone else says, as long as it takes. Well, as best we can understand for Nehemiah, it was about 5 months. We're going to understand how I got at that in just a moment. But I mention that here because I think it's important to note that the prayer that follows is not necessarily Nehemiah's prayer on day one. And I think that's important. It is either a summary of his prayer over this entire 5-month period, or it's the prayer that culminated at the end of that period. Now, I'm going to say I lean a little toward the latter, that it's the prayer that culminated, but on the other hand, I don't feel like it just suddenly formed in his mind on day 150. Given that this period was accompanied by mourning and fasting and seeking help from God that lasted 5 months, this prayer itself, I believe, formed over those months as Nehemiah poured out his heart to God, as he reflected on the state of things and what he knew of how it got that way, what he knew of what God had both predicted and promised in the past. and as he listened for understanding and wisdom that would come from God. And what I'm trying to say is as we give ourselves to prayer over a period of time, I believe part of God's answer is forming and shaping the prayer itself. I want to say that again. As we give ourselves to prayer over a period of time, I believe part of God's answer is forming and shaping the prayer itself. Sometimes we don't know what to pray for, how to pray, but I think you'll see it as we look into this prayer, how that what to do becomes part of this prayer. And I think over time, God gave Nehemiah insight. And I believe over time, God gave Nehemiah a burden and actually a plan, and what was next, and what to actually begin to do about it. And all of that becomes part of this prayer that we're going to look at right now. Verse 5. Nehemiah writes, "So then I said." Interesting. Then can mean then like right away, right after the last thing I told you. Or it could mean then as in fast forward. The last thing he said was, "For days I fasted and mourned and prayed to the God of heaven. Then I said," and here's his prayer, "O Lord God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps his covenant of unfailing love with those who love him and obey his commands, listen to my prayer. Look down and see me praying night and day for your people Israel." So see, even in this prayer, it's already been going on. And he says, this is my habit. This is what I've been doing now. This is my desperation, my commitment. Night and day I've been praying for your people Israel. Look what comes next. "I confess that we have sinned against you. Yes, even my own family and I have sinned." Interesting. When did the captivity take place? You say, "Oh, you mean I'm supposed to remember that?" 586. How many years before was it? 140 years until this moment in time. Had Nehemiah done anything to cause that to happen? No. But was Nehemiah part of a people and his ancestors? And he could say, yeah, what those people back there did, but he realizes that he too, in some ways maybe is living out some of their sins, is living out their rejection of God, is living out their unfaithfulness. And he's not just pointing blame, but he says, we as a people have sinned. Even my own family, myself included, have been unfaithful to you. Verse 7, he says, "We have sinned terribly by not obeying the commands, decrees, and regulations that you gave us through your servant Moses." Verse 8, "Now I'm asking you, God," he says, "please remember what you told your servant Moses." And here's what God told Moses to tell the people. And now Nehemiah is telling it back to God. You get that? And that's a part of prayer too, is saying, God, here's what you've said. Here's how I know that what I'm praying for, what I'm asking for is according to your will, because I'm looking at your word, and here's what you've revealed of your heart. It says, God, I'm reminding you what you said to Moses to tell us, your people. If you are unfaithful to me, I will scatter you among the nations. But that's not all. Verse 9, but if you return to me and obey my commands and live by them, then even if you are exiled to the ends of the earth, I will bring you back to the place I have chosen for my name to be honored. Did you hear that? That was God's promise to Israel. And as Nehemiah prayed for these months and reflected and sought wisdom and sought help from God, God brought these scriptures to him, these promises, this prediction of both the trouble and God's aid. If you're unfaithful to me, I will scatter you among the nations, but if you return to me, obey my commands, live by them, then even if you are exiled to the ends of the earth, I will bring you back to the place I have chosen for my name to be honored. Then he concludes his prayer, verse 10. The people you rescued by your great power and strong hand are your servants. He's saying, God, we are your people. We've failed you. We've been unfaithful, but we are yours. We belong to you. O Lord, please hear my prayer. Listen to the prayers of those of us who delight in honoring you. Interesting. It's not just my prayer now. It's those of us who are looking to you, appealing to you. Our Sunday school class downstairs was looking at a passage of Scripture that reminded us of the time when Elijah thought he was the only one. And everyone else had turned away from God, and God said to Elijah, you're not the only one. I've got 7,000 others among this great people who have not bowed their knee to Baal, who have been true to me. And here Nehemiah is recognizing that he's not alone, that there are others. They may be a minority, but there are others there in Susa probably. There are others back in Judah who are praying, who are crying out to say, God, help us. Oh Lord, please hear my prayer. Listen to the prayers of those of us, not all, but those of us who delight in honoring you, who are seeking your help. And then this next part tells me that this is at the end of the 5 months. Please grant me success today by making the king favorable to me. Put it into his heart to be kind to me. I believe by this point God has given him, through his praying, through his listening, God has given him a plan, or at least a next step. And that's been revealed, but he still is recognizing his dependence upon God, his need of God in the midst of all of this, his need of God to do what he himself cannot do. Please grant me success today by making the king favorable to me. Put it into his heart to be kind to me. End of prayer. Footnote, in those days, I was the king's cupbearer. There's a connection, but even the cupbearer can't just walk in and make demands. As we learned of another king and a situation that was in Persia around this same time, maybe a little bit earlier. Remember the story of Esther? She was the queen, and she was Jewish, and her people were in grave danger. And she took her life into her hands literally by walking into the king's presence uninvited. That's part of the context here. And so we get to chapter 2. Early the following spring, this would have been like April, May, 5 months later, the month of Nisan, during the 20th year of King Artaxerxes' reign, I was serving the king his wine. I had never before appeared sad in his presence. If you're the cupbearer to the king, no matter what's going on in your life, you probably got to have a happy face. Don't make the king sad. Keep your problems at home. I'd never before been sad in the king's presence. Obviously, the king noticed. So the king asked me, why are you looking sad? You don't look sick to me. You must be deeply troubled. Then I was terrified. But 5 months of prayer had brought him to this moment. Then I was terrified, but I replied. You see, courage isn't the absence of fear. Perhaps you've heard this before. Courage isn't the absence of fear. Courage is taking the steps that you're called to take in the face of fear. Then I was terrified, but I replied, long live the king. How can I not be sad? For the city where my ancestors are buried is in ruins, and the gates have been destroyed by fire. The king asked, well, how can I help you? Nehemiah is still praying. With a prayer to the God of heaven, this pause, this deep breath, and once more saying, God, it's now or never. God, you've got to do this. With a prayer to the God of heaven, I replied, if it please the king, and if you are pleased with me, your servant, send me to Judah to rebuild the city where my ancestors are buried. Just a small request. Now, I know there are a lot of differences between this story and our setting. Don't think for a moment that I'm suggesting that our congregation is in ruins. There's a lot of incredible strength here and has been for a lot of years, and we are extremely blessed as part of this church. We've never been in captivity. Well, maybe I'll back off of that a little bit. Maybe there are ways of thinking, maybe there are mindsets, there are attitudes that hold us captive and we don't even recognize it. Maybe we are at times held captive to our own self-interest, our own comfort, our own consumer mentality. Maybe even as part of a church, we can be in captivity and not even know it. And maybe we do need a fresh word from God to show us what condition we are in. Not in terms of numbers and programs, but in terms of our spiritual health, in terms of our hearts. And that's part of what this process is about, is help us to maybe see some things that we've just become accustomed to about how we are and about what has become important to us, and maybe things that are very important, that should be important to us, that we've neglected. So maybe there has been a captivity somewhere on our story, and maybe there still is in some ways. And I'm saying we here. I'm not saying you. Similarities. It started with maybe a few who were concerned and understood the need, who came to realize that they weren't the only ones. It started with recognition and with prayer, with seeking help from God. And that recognition and that prayer led to the idea of a specific plan to ask for more help. And that idea was followed by more prayer, which was followed by actually asking for help. And then asking for support and the help of all in walking this path. There's a lot more to come in the coming weeks as we unpack this, where we're going to see a lot of things, I think, lessons that we can draw from Nehemiah's experience. And in the big picture, what's happening in Israel in this story is a new beginning. But when we think of new beginnings, we often think of starting over. We think of, a new place, a new location, a new job, new circumstances. We think of a new beginning, going someplace else, changing this, changing that. But that's not what's happening here. This is not a new beginning of place and circumstances. This is saying, God, renew your work in your people, in your place, in this place that has been a place where your name has been honored for many generations. And we want to see your name honored there again. This is a new beginning of renewal within a people identified by a certain place. I'm grateful that as we look at this story and the example of Nehemiah, that we can also see some things that Nehemiah did and say, wow, even without looking at this example, we're kind of already there, aren't we? The role of prayer in this whole process, not even before the idea came and before we started consulting with other people, consulting with God first, and then as this idea was formed and continuing to do that, and all during the season of Lent, a group of people who were faithfully praying for this process and for our church. And the prayer doesn't end. Every step along the way to be like Nehemiah and take that breath and say, okay, God, I know you gave us this idea and you've led us this far, but now we need you in this next step. Okay, God, I'm about to make this request to the king. I have his attention. He noticed there's a problem. He noticed I'm sad, and I told him the reason I'm sad, and there's no turning back now. He asked what he could do to help. I have no idea what he's going to do, what he's going to say. But I believe you've led me to ask for his help. And there's no turning back. So our theme this morning was seeking help. That's a place to start, whatever our circumstance might be, in a group, collective, within a family, within an individual. To become aware of a need, our first response is to seek help and to turn to God first, and to seek God's wisdom and where else to turn. Nehemiah did that. We've done that. You say, well, what happened to Nehemiah? I know we're anxious. What's going to happen with us? And, well, we're going to be patient. That's what's going to happen. If nothing else happens, we're going to learn patience at the end of this year, right? A lot else is going to happen. But I can tell you at least the next little bit of what happened with Nehemiah. Verse 6, chapter 2, the king with the queen sitting beside him asked, give me some more details. Tell me a little bit more about this idea, this request of yours. How long will you be gone? When will you return? They need to permanently replace you as cupbearer or just get a temp agency involved? I mean, how's this going to impact me? After I told him how long I would be gone, the king agreed to my request. Yes. Oh, but it's bigger than this. King doesn't just say, yeah, you can go. I'll free you up. I'll give you this. The vacation? Probably not. With or without pay? I mean, really, what's reasonable to ask for in a situation like this? Well, the king says, okay, you can go. Next verse. Oh, by the way, I also said to the king, if it please the king, let me have letters addressed to the governors of the province west of the Euphrates River, instructing them to let me travel safely through their territories on my way to Judah. That's reasonable. A letter saying, Nehemiah is not in rebellion. Nehemiah has my permission to be traveling to do what he's doing, so that as I come through these other territories, I can show them. Kind of like, yes, you have permission from the teacher to go to the restroom. So you get this piece of paper saying, I'm here by permission, okay? That's kind of what's going on here. And please give me a letter addressed to Asaph, the manager of the king's forest, instructing him to give me timber. I will need it to make beams for the gates of the temple fortress, for the city walls, and for a house for myself. Not only am I asking for permission to go, but would you pay for the expenses? Not just my travel, but I mean of this reconstruction, of this renewal process. And the king granted these requests because the gracious hand of God was on me. Not only that, but we read further and find that the king also sent some guards with him, a small army to protect him on his journey.